looked at. So as we dive in tonight, Ecclesiastes comes from the idea of being called out to an assembly, a gathering, and so that's what we are tonight. But also that's the idea in the book because the word used here for preacher is the Hebrew word to gather people, and so we're gathering together to study this book. And this book, Ecclesiastes, is most likely, and for my opinion, is written by Solomon. It's written at the end of his life, most likely. If you know much about Solomon, he is got wisdom from God when he took over the kingdom after David, his father, passed away. He was young, didn't know how to handle things, and so God came to him and gave him the option of asking him anything he wanted. And Solomon says, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take you up on that, and I'll ask for wisdom." And so God gave him wisdom, and Solomon ended up writing three books in the Old Testament. He wrote Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. Now, my opinion is that he wrote Song of Songs when he was early in life, when he had just got married. And if you know much about Solomon, because later in life he had a lot of wives and a lot of concubines, which would not lean to the Song of Solomon. So he wrote that early in life, and then in the midlife he wrote Proverbs, which is a how to be successful type of a book with Proverbs all throughout it. And then I believe he wrote this at the end of his life, and you get toward the end, chapter 12, you will see him talking about being old and how that affects the way that we approach life and think about life. And I'll say this because I've taught through the book of Ecclesiastes on several different occasions. When I was doing student ministry, I taught teenagers, took them through this book. I've done it in small group. I've actually done it here before years ago, and so this will be like the fourth time I've taught through it. And I'll say, the older I get, the more this book makes sense. So that's why I know that he wrote it later in life, because it makes more sense as I get older. Doesn't mean that you can't understand it when you're young, but you really begin to see what Solomon means as you walk through this. So when you get to the end of the book, he'll talk about when the grinders of the mill grind no longer, and he's talking about your teeth falling out, and he talks about stooping, and as you get older, you discover, hey, he's really describing a person in their old age. And so the theme of the book is to discover the meaning of life, and it helps us to discover our purpose in this life. And if you've ever felt like that you didn't have any purpose, this book will help you to work that out. If you've ever been frustrated, this book is like that. This book is about those subjects. And so it's called Wisdom Literature. It's one of 5 books that the Bible section that we call Wisdom Literature is designed to help you to not only know what God would have for you, but to how to put it in your life and apply it. It's written approximately 1,000 years before Jesus ever walked the earth. And so sometimes when you read, at least for me, you guys might be smarter than I am, but sometimes when I read Ecclesiastes, sometimes when I read Proverbs, it's almost like a little bit listening to Yoda, if you're familiar with Star Wars, and you're like, what did he just say? And so you got to think harder. So what Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and wisdom literature does is cause you to dig a little deeper. And often, if you're like me, I would just want to go, can you just say it plainly? I'm a little slow, a little simple-minded. But what it does is it causes you to dig a little deeper and think a little harder. So we'll do that as we dive into Ecclesiastes and work our way through it. One interesting note that I want you to pay attention to as we go through Ecclesiastes and all 12 chapters is when Solomon is writing this, he doesn't ever use the term for God, the Lord. And if you don't know much about translation of the scriptures, the Lord is capital Lord, typically in your English, means Jehovah or Yahweh, and that's his covenant name with Israel. That means whenever you read that, you should automatically think, this is the God who has a relationship with Israel. And so therefore in the Old Testament, when you read that, it is the Lord, where when you see just the word God, it is the word Elohim, which is his name that is used like in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. And so God is his creator name, his powerful name, where Lord is the one that you have a relationship to, and the Israelites would know because he saved them. And so throughout Ecclesiastes, he only uses God. He only references God as God. So he only refers to him as Elohim. And he uses that name about 40 times through this writing. The reason he does that is because this book, I believe, is designed for all people, not just for Israel, but it's designed for people who live on earth just like us, who are trying to figure out life. And many of the people in the world, because they have not had the revelation of God, because they have not gotten wisdom from God, they either live atheistically, so they live as if God doesn't exist, or they live agnostically, which means that simply they believe that God exists, but you can't really have a relationship with him. You can't really know who he is. So this is written in that direction, but also for us who do believe in God and have placed our faith in Jesus Christ. This has a lot of application for us, but it's specifically designed to help people find meaning in their life, especially when they become frustrated with life. Now, when you read Ecclesiastes, if you just go home and read it tonight, or if you've read it before, you'll know when you first read it, it sounds like somebody's depressed. And it's frustrating, and you feel that when you read it. And so it's written in that way to help people who are frustrated with life to begin to understand what their purpose is in life. So there's a phrase that we're going to pay attention to as we read. So you've got the name of God. And there's another important phrase that I want to highlight. And I'm bringing these things up for you so that when you hear them, your mind goes to the right place. And so as we read through the passage, there's a phrase called under the sun. Now, under the sun is a phrase that means to live life on earth without reference or connection to God. So when you see that, you need to think this is referring to just how everybody lives, either atheistically or agnostically, and they don't live with a relationship to God. They don't live as they have a creator. They're just going through life existing. And so under the sun, that's what that means. And so pay attention to it. And that's what he is going after. So the audience for this is basically those who live their life without reference to God. And I would also offer to you that this is written for people who are fluent, specifically people like us in America. And you may say, well, I'm not affluent because, I don't live in that neighborhood and I don't have that big of a house. Well, compared to the rest of the world, you are rich. And you may not think you're rich, but I guarantee you most of the people in our city are in the top 10% of the world. If you have a car, you're probably in about the top 10% of the richest people in the world. And most of us got here tonight because we got in a car. I didn't see anybody walking up. I didn't see anybody riding a bike. Maybe you did, but I didn't see it. So this is written for people who are affluent. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes is interesting because throughout the history of Israel, they would read this book at a particular time throughout the nation. It was read during what is called the Feast of Tabernacles, or the ingathering. This was the time that people lived in tents, and it was considered a season of joy. It was harvest time. And you know why harvest time would be a season of joy, because all your hard work is paying off, and you got produce, and so everybody's excited. And so this would be what you would read during that month, and it would be observed as the last feast of the year, and it would fall in the month of Tishra. And so this holiday and this feast we find in Leviticus 23 and 24. And so this time you would live in tents, and you'd be excited because you'd get a harvest. And so what better time to read this book to sober you up and have a reality check than the time where you're gaining affluence, you're gaining prosperity. And so this book helps to keep us in line. So with that said, let's dive into Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So how do we know who wrote this? This is the identity of the writer or author of the book. The writer is never specifically mentioned to be Solomon, and some people would debate that it is Solomon, but I think the identity is a certain description. Historically, the Jews have held that Solomon wrote this, and so if you look at these specific references, you have the preacher, which is Solomon. He's a teacher because he has wisdom. He also, we know that the son of David, directly from David, is Solomon. And then third, there only been so many sons of David. And then we knew that the next son of David after he passed away was Solomon. And so I think the easy reference for this is that this is Solomon, the son of David, who is king in Jerusalem. And so the interesting thing about Solomon that you may not know is that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem after David passed away. Solomon is also the son of David and Bathsheba. I don't know if you knew that, but if you don't know that story, that's like the scandalous story. This is David, when David committed murder and had an affair. And this is the woman that he had an affair with that he eventually took as his wife. And they have a son named Solomon together, and he becomes the king. And as I told you, Solomon asked for wisdom. And so Solomon has this wisdom, and he begins to share it with the people, especially the Israelites, and thankfully all of us by the Holy Spirit. So verse 2, here's what he says. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, the teacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And so sometimes if you're using a different translation other than the ESV, it may say meaningless, meaningless. All is meaningless. The idea is that the word hevel, which is in the Hebrew here, is being used. So like vanity of vanities is like if you say holy of holies, you're talking about this is the greatest, this is a superlative. And he's saying when I look at life, what I've discovered that life is meaningless. And meaningless kind of seems a little bit more capturing the idea that everything about life is just empty and void. And really what he's saying is that the idea behind that Hebrew word is that it's like smoke. And if you've ever tried to grab smoke, you can't ever get your hand on it. And so the idea is that like every time I try to get a hold of this, it seems to slip away and I can't get a hold of it. And so there's this emptiness in my hand when I reach out for my breath or this. And so Solomon is not being a Debbie Downer. What Solomon is doing is bringing us to reality that this is what life is like. And he wants all of us to think about life because life is frustrating. So what he does in verse 3 is says this. He asks a question. And I want you to answer this in your head when we read it. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? So what does man profit? What advantage does he get for all the work that he does on the face of the earth? And notice the phrase, under the sun. So the question is, so what does man gain? What does he prosper? What advantage does he have? And he works his tail off without reference or connection to God. What's the answer? The answer is nothing. Jesus said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul? And so this is something that Jesus has echoed, that life is frustrating. The obvious answer is nothing. And here's the thing that changes when you know Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the great chapter on the resurrection and what it means for us as believers. Now, what Solomon's saying, and what I don't want you to walk away from here, is to say, well, you know, Ecclesiastes just says, you know, everything's meaningless. So, you know, let's get, you know, crazy and because tomorrow we're dying. That's not the idea. But in 1558, Paul writes these words. He says, therefore, my beloved brothers. So that's everybody who's placed their faith in Jesus. This is how it changes everything. Be steadfast, immovable, and always bounding, notice this, in the work of the Lord. So he's not saying get passive, don't do anything. He's saying keep on working. And here's why he says it. Knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So if you have a relationship with Jesus and you work for Jesus and you do all this ministry and you serve people and you love people, that is not in vain. It's when you work without a reference to Christ and you live your life without a reference to God that it all ends up for nothing. Because what you do for the Lord lasts. It has an eternal impact. And that's what Paul is saying. So don't miss this and say, well, you know, This is just depressing because it doesn't matter what I do, it doesn't matter anyway. And what Paul is saying is, if you live with your life in reference to Jesus Christ and you live for Him and you work for Him, then you can be sure of this, that the things that you do will last and they matter. And that's good news. So I don't want us to miss that as we walk through this. So he answers that question, and then he gives these 4 cycles that'll be in the next 4 verses. These cycles help us to understand that the frustration of life. Here's what he says. The first cycle. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. This is sort of the life cycle. This is birth and this is death, and then people pass away. Every generation that has lived has said, we're going to be the generation that changes everything. And what Solomon says is, your generation ain't changing nothing. Your generation's going to come, and your generation's going to go. It's happened before you. The generation now has come, and it's going to go. And nothing's really going to change. There are going to be some innovations, and somebody's going to invent something called the internet, and they're going to do this, and they're going to do that. But really, your generation's not going to change anything. And so, this goes against the college speech when they graduate. You're going to be the generation that changes the world. No, you're not. Isn't that depressing? It's a life cycle. And what he's saying is not to try to discourage people, but he's contrasting this with generational changes. The earth remains the same. The basic nature of the earth never changes. He said it's like the guy who gets on the treadmill at the gym and he's running, but he really doesn't ever go anywhere. That's what life is like. And that's why it's frustrating. You live on a ball that completely turns all the time. It keeps moving, but there's not really any progress. And so the world is like that for people who live, for people who live their life without God. That's what he's saying. So you can be moving, but really not having productivity. You can be active, but not really be having productivity. Here's the second cycle. Check it out. The sun rises, the sun sets, goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. I don't know if you've thought about that, but the day goes by. The older you get, doesn't it seem like those days go by a lot faster than they used to? So you get up, it's Monday morning, make your coffee, do whatever you do before you leave. You get in your car. You may even leave before the sun rises. And then what happens? Before you know it, your work day's done, and what's the sun doing? It's hitting the other side. And then you go back the next night, and you may watch a TV show, play with the kids, do this or do that. What do you do the next day? You do the same thing. And so what Solomon is saying is he's just making an observation. Look, the sun rises, it sets. Nothing really changes. Depressing, isn't it? The days fly by. So this emptiness that he's talking about, this vanity of vanities, it's just like when James says, life is like a vapor. It's here and it's gone. And so these are the cycles of life. He says in this next cycle, the wind blows to the south and it goes around to the north, and around it goes the wind. And on its circuits, the wind returns. If you look at the wind, you just see it keeps blowing. Where's it come from? I don't know, but it keeps coming. The wind blows every day. And so you see this cycle playing out every day. And it's just another cycle. And nothing really ever changes. Then he says, all streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. So when I was back in college, I had to take this earth science class or something like that, and we learned about that process. And you get some rain, it fills up, runs down the mountains in the river, and then it, evaporates and eventually ends up back in the clouds, and after it goes out in the ocean, and you got this cycle that goes. And it's a never-ending cycle. It happens all the time, and nothing really ever seems to change. And so here's what he says about all of that. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. And so these things are wearisome. The activity wears you down. It's tiring. Even the study of books is wearisome. I know that because I get to study a lot. If you've ever been in high school, college, or something like that, you know you get tired of even studying. It gets tiresome. And he says, this stuff can wear you down. And here's why it wears you down. All of this stuff. Because man is unable to understand everything. He can't make sense of it. Is there stuff in your life you're just like, I really don't understand what's going on? And it just seems like you're caught on the treadmill. And he says, what he's saying is we all have limited understanding. You know, these things are weary. They wear you out. I can't explain it. And my eye and my ear never hears enough, and my eye never sees enough. It never gets full. It gets tiring. It gets frustrating. If you're old enough, or you know music well enough, you'll remember a song by Mick Jagger's band, the Rolling Stones. I can't get no satisfaction. And what do? You try, and you try, but you can't. That's what Solomon's saying. And I'm not even Rolling Stones fan, but I know that song, and that fits with this. And so his conclusion to that is this, in verse 9. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. And maybe somebody who's older has told you at one point in your life, son, there ain't nothing new under the sun. He didn't think of it. Solomon said it. As the Holy Spirit moved him, there's nothing new in the sun. Notice it's under the sun. There's nothing new when it comes to man living his life without reference to God. So what was in the past existed, and it will be in the future. What was done in the past will be done in the future. So there's nothing new under the sun without God. And so here's the thing, when you read that and you ask yourself, well, there's all kinds of innovations and things like that go on. Yes, there are. But there really is not anything new under the sun. In other words, people advance and they do things. And, you know, back when I came to Grace Point 15 years ago, things have changed. I mean, there have been like little changes and innovations, but really nothing's ever changed. People are really the same. They haven't really changed over the year. I was talking to somebody about ministry, and I said, here's a crazy thing about the Bible is that the Bible is as relevant for the time that it was written as it is today. It may be harder to understand because we're a different culture and background, but really nothing's ever changed. Humanity is not really ever changed. The mountains are really the same. The oceans are really the same. Really, nothing's really changed. And if you really talk about something being created that is new, only God does that. All we do as humans is craft things. We take something that God created and we craft it and try to be innovative, but only God really creates that which is new. And so the verse 10 is the question that Solomon anticipates that we would ask. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? And he says, it has already been in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, and nor will there be any remembrance of later things, yet to be among those who come after. So here's what he says. He said, see this? And he says, you say to Solomon, see, this is new. Solomon says, that ain't new. No, that's not new. It's only new to you. But it's not actually new. God is the only one who makes things new. He said everything that exists has really already existed in some form. And so the idea is that everything that we are doing, even when we're innovative, we're really recycling and reforming it. And so if you study history, you know that that's what happens. If you don't study history, you're bound to repeat it. And so here's what he says. He says, there's no remembrance of the things. So the past is forgotten, but truth will always be remembered. But here's the thing. Future generations will have the same experience that we will have. We all think that we will be remembered when we die. I got news for you. You won't. Maybe a generation, maybe two. Let me ask you a question. Who was, y'all going to impress me, I know, because y'all smart people, was the 14th president of the United States? Teachers up in the room, where you at? Are we talking about the president of the United States? Does anybody know? Who's the 16th? Yeah, I mean, you know, he's kind of lasted a little longer than the rest. But everybody's like, I don't know who was 16th. 14th president was Franklin Pierce. But look, here's the thing. President of the United States, and if I ask you, well, who's it? And if I ask you, so tell me something about old Franklin. Well, now I remember he's the president. But that's all we know, because the past will be forgotten. Let me ask you this. Who invented the automatic bread slicer? I mean, don't you say it? This is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I don't know who made it, because we forget. We're not remembered. And that's Solomon's point, is that even when things are new. Let's bring this on home. There's some sports fans in the room. Who was the MVP of the NFL last year? Anybody know? One person knows. The rest of us like, I have no idea who it was. Who was the year before? No, so I don't know. He might be right. I don't know. He could fake me out there. He don't know either. He's guessing and go, I'm a little smart. So here's the idea. Is that, look, let me ask you this. Think about this for a second. How many of you know your great-great-grandfather's name? How many of you know your great-grandfather's? How many of you know your grandfather's name? Well, you know, I mean, but my point is generations come, generations go, and what Solomon's point is you're not going to remember all that. And so we spend all this time trying to be remembered, and then we're frustrated because at the end of the day, generations are going to come, generations are going to go, and we get frustrated a lot. Because here's what really matters. Do you live your life in connection and reference to God? That's what he's driving at. And I'll be driving at that the whole time. So let's take a look at this last section. He says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. So Solomon is talking about himself and pointing out this. And he says, here's what I did. And giving a testimony about my life. And I applied my heart to seek and to search out wisdom, all that is done under heaven. Now, it's a little bit different phrase. It is an unhappy business that God has given to children of man to be busy with. And I've seen everything that's done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. So Solomon's question is this. Does intellectualism give us an answer to the question about the meaning of life? Does reason help us to figure it all out? In other words, if I get smarter, will I be happier? The more I know will bring me more satisfaction. Solomon, one thing I think is true about Solomon, as you read Ecclesiastes and you study life, Solomon's one of those guys that when he gets into something, he's all into it. Like Solomon, when he gets into something, he's going to go have the full experience, and he's going to have the T-shirt to show you that he had the experience kind of guy. And so as you read Solomon's life, he's full speed ahead. He's not a dabbler. Like some of us dabble into things. He doesn't dabble. He goes in, like jumps off the high dive into the deep end. He don't just stick his toe in. He goes all in. He's the guy that's going to jump out of the plane and skydive. He's the guy who wants to learn how, to go scuba diving. That's who he is. And one of the things that's interesting about him is it doesn't matter what it is as we walk through this, whether it's academics or it's finances or it's sex or it's materialism or it's religion. He went all in with his life. And so he's got some things to say about it. And here's the interesting thing, I think. Solomon answers the question about the meaning of life And, there are all kinds of books in the Bible that get to the questions that, like, we have about our life. For example, like, if you have a question about the origins of life, about your birth and where you come from, there's a book about that that God has given us called Genesis. Genesis means the book of beginnings. And so you discover, where do we come from? Because that's one of the main questions that anybody asks. We want to know where we came from. I would say one of the other big questions is the meaning of life, about, why do we exist? What is our purpose? And I think that question is answered in Ecclesiastes. Some of us have a question about our destiny. What's going to happen to us when we die? I think one of the books that gets to the answer to that question is the book of Revelation, written by John the Apostle, the last book of the Bible. Then there's the question of, hey, what's the meaning of suffering evil? Why do bad things happen to good people? I think you can go to the book of Job and you begin to discover why bad things happen to good people, and you get some answers to those questions. It comes to sex and love. You've got Solomon's book, the Song of Songs. If it comes to how can I be more successful in life, you've got Proverbs. There are books all throughout the Bible that speak to certain areas of your life. And if you know the books of the Bible, what you do is you know where to go when you're dealing with certain things in your life. So if you're struggling with frustration and purpose, you would go to Ecclesiastes and you would spend time there and let God teach you what's most important. And what really matters is a life lived with a connection with Him. And so that's what these books are designed to do. So sometimes people go, where do I start reading? Well, you need to start reading where you've got your questions. How does a man get saved? Go read John's Gospel. How do I apply Christianity to my life? Go read James. If you are going through a time of difficulty, go read 1 Peter. Basically, Peter writes a syllabus for suffering. And so when you know what's in the book, then you know which of the books in the big book to go to. And that's really the point. So this one is about meaning. Is there meaning to my life? Have you ever asked that question? Animals don't ask that question. Your pets, my pets, don't ask that question. And you say, well, how do you know that? Because I have pets. They don't ever seem like they're thinking about anything except a few things, because they're driven by impulse. They're thinking about what they're going to eat next. They're thinking about sleeping. They're thinking about, what else are they thinking about? Where they can poop. They're thinking about the things that animals think about. They operate on impulses, not values. They are not asking the question, oh, Master, could you teach me the meaning of life? They just wanted you to give them a treat. And that's the difference between us and animals. So Solomon writes this, and he says, hey, this is what I've been through. And so this is his personal experience. He says, to seek, so is him looking, and to search is his discovery. So how is he looking? By wisdom on all that is done, which is his experience and observation. Where has he done this? He's done it under heaven. That is, in the natural world where we live. So under heaven would be, if you were heaven as it is in heaven, not on earth. And so he says, so this is what I'm talking about on earth. And Solomon is a perfect candidate to do this kind of research because he has the passion, he has the wisdom, and the resources to do the kind of discovery that most of us could never do. Solomon is the wisest man outside of Jesus to ever live. He's also probably the richest man to ever live. So therefore, when he says, I can seek and search, he has the ability and the means to do it. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I watched this show called The Curse of Oak Island. And anybody with me, my Curse of Oak Island people? Most of you don't watch it. You're probably smarter than I am. But I got hooked years ago at Thanksgiving because there was nothing else on. And so I just kind of been following it. And the reason is interesting to me. I don't know if they're ever going to find anything, but I watch it. I don't know. So it doesn't really mean it's vanity. I know that. So I watch it, but here's my point. So there's two guys on the show named Marty and Rick Lagina. Now, the reason that they can seek and search, because they're looking for things like the Ark of the Covenant in Canada on this island that's supposed to have been taken there by the Templar people and all that stuff. And so they've been looking for this. I think we're about like season 8, so it's been 8 years. And here's why they can do this show, because they have the resources to do it. Marty Lagina is probably worth, depending on which internet source you use, from anywhere from $40 million to $100 million. That's why he can go dig up Oak Island, because he has the means to do it. Now, so like what Solomon is saying is, why he's a candidate to teach us this is because he has the wisdom, he has passion, he's all in, and he has the resources to discover this. And so this is what he says. He says, this is my testimony. You know, if you're going to do research, like if you want to do research, you can get a grant because you need resources to be able to do research. And that's what he has. And so he's able to do this. And so he makes an observation. He says, the sons of men, which are the sons of Adam, he said, these sons of men, they are, in Adam, man in Hebrew is Adam. And so he says they are in this unhappy business, this grievous work, this hard task, because they're born because of sin and his fallen state, they're under the curse. If you go back to Genesis, what you discover about, if you say, well, why are things the way they are? Why do they never seem to work out? Because man disobeyed God. Adam disobeyed God. We fell into sin, and it changed everything. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had everything perfect. They were relationally perfect with God and with each other. That all changed when they sinned. Work was enjoyable. It was great. But when they sinned, Adam, he started sweating, and then he got thorns and thistles to deal with, and everything changed. In the garden, before they sinned, they had a spiritually rich life. I mean, they were walking with God daily. And then when they sinned, they broke that relationship. You know, they didn't die. They were living a long time. They were walking around. And, I mean, this is hard for us to imagine because we don't live this way, and it's because of the fallen nature of the world. They're walking around. Doesn't it ever, like when you read, they were naked and they didn't know it? All of us, if we're naked, we know it. The reason you know it is because sin came into the world. So here's what he's saying. He's saying, look, I've watched this, and everything that is done under heaven, it's an unhappy business, and why it's so frustrating is because sin came into the world. And so he says, I've seen everything done under the sun without relationship to God, and I've taken a comprehensive look at it, and my conclusion and interpretation is this. It's two things. It's vanity, which is verse 14. I've seen everything that's done under the sun. Behold, it's all vanity and a striving after wind. In other words, it's vanity, it's emptiness. It's like trying to grab smoke. It's all the stuff you worry about. It's affecting the way you think. You cannot get it. Think about this. When because all of us are adults, all those things that you worried about in middle school, all those things that you worried about in high school, now you look at it and go, well, why does that bother me? It was meaningless. And the older you get, you keep having that experience. And then he says it's chasing after wind. Anybody ever chase after wind? You try to grab it. What happens? You don't get it. You can't capture it in a bottle. It's meaningless. And so this is what he says. So what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. And this is a proverb. A proverb is a simple truth stated in a common sense way that people can understand it. And in particular, like you can have a proverb that's not written by a person under the compulsion and inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and it can be something that's generally true. But then you can have, in this case, that the Lord is moving him to pen this, and so it's inspiration plus his experience and common sense that helps us to understand this truth. So what he says is, what is crooked cannot be straightened out. Anybody ever broke a bone? If you were to x-ray your bone that's been broken, you know, it's been placed, and so it's been crooked. It's probably not straight like it used to be. I got a couple of I got a collarbone that I broke twice playing football, and it's not crooked. It's crooked. It ain't like it was. And then I got a hand where I punched a guy in the face in the 6th grade, and I broke it, and that bone in my hand is still crooked. And what is crooked cannot be straightened. You ever taken a wire hanger, tried to unlock a door or something? You ever try to straighten that hanger back out the way it was? It cannot be done. That's what Solomon's saying. This cannot be done. What is crooked cannot be straightened out. The point of this is everything and every one has gotten crooked in the world under the sun and cannot be straightened. Only God can straighten out that which is crooked. So God is the only one who can really fix our problems. And what he's saying is knowledge can't fix this. Your intellect can't fix it. And so we have to turn to God for salvation, for example. So think about this one. If knowledge could really change people and fix people, then all we'd have to do at church is to totally educate everyone. But it doesn't matter how much education you give some people. You can talk till you're blue in the face, but they don't change. Because only God can fix what's wrong with people. So what has to happen is people have to have the revelation of God, not just reason to be able to change. Because that which is crooked cannot be straightened. You can't fix it. And what is lacking cannot be counted. And so here's what Solomon says. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had a great experience of wisdom and knowledge. Question. Do you talk to yourself? Yes. If you talk to yourself inwardly, you're okay. If you talk to yourself outwardly, I'm not going to say it. Solomon said in his heart, not out loud with his mouth, but in his heart, this is what's happened. He says, I've accomplished some things. I've acquired knowledge unlike anyone who's ever lived before me in Jerusalem. There's been no one like that. He's not saying this arrogantly. He's saying this truthfully because, why? Because he's had the passion, the wisdom of God given to him, and he's had the resources to discover it. And so what he's saying is true. And so he says, I've had the ability to do this. And he says, so I've had this great experience. And then in verse 17, I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, and I perceive that this is also striving after wind. So here's what he said. I accomplished this. I acquired knowledge, and I wanted to know everything. Now, when I went to college years ago, and I went to Mercer University, I had in my mind, I was a follower of Christ, and really what I wanted to do, and I think this is the teacher nature in me, is that I wanted to be able to go and learn enough that I could answer everybody's question, no matter what it was. It did not take me long to figure out that I cannot do that. It was a naive notion. It was a noble notion, I think. I think it's a good thing to, if you're going to be a teacher, to want to know. My conclusion was this. I can know a lot, and that's what he's saying, but I won't ever be close to knowing everything, and you won't either. And even when you get in heaven, see, we get told when we get to heaven, we'll know everything. No, you won't. Because if you knew everything, you'd be God, right? So when you get to heaven, you and I are still going to be discipled by Jesus because we won't know everything. Now, we'll truly see clearly who God is, and we'll have a lot more knowledge than we have right now, and our knowledge will not be tainted by our flesh and our sin. Praise God. But you won't know everything. So the question is, so when we get to heaven, what are we going to do all eternity? One of the things you're going to do is you're going to keep learning. As long as you live, you will learn. And that should blow your mind because, like, how big is God and how incredible is God that we could spend eternity and always be learning? That's pretty incredible. And what Solomon is saying is, I've acquired knowledge. I went to acquire knowledge. But I've discovered, you know what? Doesn't matter how much knowledge I have. There's something always still to learn. And here's the key for all of us. And I want to throw this out because I think it's important. it's not what you know that matters in life, it's who you know. I don't need to know everything because I know the one who does know everything. And when you know the one who knows everything, you don't have to worry about everything. You let him worry about it. And as you get to know him, you will know more than you ever thought. And that's what I think Solomon's getting at ultimately, is to say, hey, look, you can live your life without a connection to God. You can say, hey, I think we were created or evolved like this, and there's a bang, or whatever you want to do. But what Solomon's saying is, I've been there and done that and got the T-shirt. And what I'm saying to you is, who you know is a lot more important than what you know. And if you want to live your life with just knowing stuff under the sun without reference to God, then go ahead. And then he goes on to say this, and I applied my heart to knowledge and wisdom and no madness and folly. So he says, I wanted to know wisdom, which is intellectualism, the mental capacity. I wanted to know madness and folly. In other words, I wanted to live immorally, just sort of a pure hedonism. It almost sounds like Solomon went to college. He went to study, and then when he got through studying, he went to party. That's what it sounds like. And so he says, this is how I live my life. And he's saying, as I did this, I discovered there was an emptiness to it. It's a cycle. I go through the week, and then I work, and I study, and then I'm living for the weekend. I got Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and then I'm back where I was, and this is a cycle. And he says, and at the end of it, you feel empty, especially if it's without reference to God. It's just under the sun. And so he ends this with a proverb. He says, in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases in knowledge increases in sorrow. Increased wisdom equals increased vexation, which is worry and frustration. So it ends up being, if you increase in knowledge, really, without God, it just leads to a troubled mind. If you increase in knowledge, it increases your pain and sorrow, which is what? A troubled heart. So just gaining knowledge doesn't fix your problems. It doesn't cause you to quit worrying. It doesn't make you escape pain. Only God can fix those things in our life. You ever heard the statement, ignorance is bliss? I was a lot happier when I didn't know. That's why some of us wish we were still kids. I didn't know all that. My life seemed a lot happier. It's probably what you tell your kids. You don't need to know all that. Happiness, when you don't have the knowledge of it, is normal for all of us. But like when we get knowledge, we discover that it leads to vexation, it leads to pain and sorrow. I always think about it like this. There's certain things that come to mind when I think about, God gives us knowledge, which is revelation, and there's things that we know that we discover through experience and things. How many of you like sausage? Do you know how it's made? How many of you like sausage? That's the point. I'm all happy with eating sausage until I see how it's made. I'd rather not know how it's made. Don't let me see that. I don't want to see it. I really like hot dogs. Please don't let me look at that. Because ignorance can be bliss. I have a friend who goes to our church here. He once went to a restaurant, and they were sitting there, and he watched this guy pour his ketchup out, and he was hitting the top of it. And then after the guy got the ketchup out of the bottle, poured on it, he took the bottle, and he licked the edge of it and put the cap back on. Now my friend has vexation. He has troubled mind and troubled heart whenever he goes to a restaurant. Because knowledge doesn't solve your problems. It can create them. If you've ever worked in a restaurant, you don't want to know what goes back there. You just eat. Because knowledge like that doesn't help you. What knowledge does is, when it's from God, it changes your life because it's really helpful. And so, it's interesting. It says so, For much wisdom is vexation, and he increases in knowledge is sorrow. It's why when you get older, you get fearful and cynical. Some of us are farther along in that than others. But if you know God, you don't have to fear and you don't have to be cynical, because the gospel changes everything. Because what you can rest in, I said this to somebody today when I was doing some counseling. I said, here's the two things that I rest in. I rest in God's grace and God's sovereignty. Those two things change everything for me. That God forgives me of my sins and doesn't hold my past against me, and that he's got my future under control. Man, that's the kind of things I need to know. I don't need to know everything else. I just need to know those things, because that takes away my fear and cynicism. Information, education, experience are good things. But without reference to God, they really don't give us any meaning. When it comes to life and salvation, no one can reason themselves into the kingdom. They have to discover by revelation. Nobody will go tonight and sit under a tree, even the tree in Broxton, the tree of knowledge, and walk away from that tree and go, you know what? It's Jesus. The only way they'll know that is because God has revealed himself in Jesus, and someone has shared the good news of Jesus, and Jesus makes our life make sense. And Jesus gives us purpose. That's where all this is going. What Solomon's doing is helping us to say, hey, reason is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. We're not down on reason. We're not down on growing intellectually. So if my sons, back when they were in school, we'd have a conversation, well, why do I need to learn this? Why do I need to learn English? I'd say, you need to talk good. No, I'm just kidding. You need to communicate. And if you're going to glorify God and you're going to communicate the gospel, you need to learn to speak the language. Why do I need to learn math? Because God has made you a steward over his creation, and you need to know how to add, subtract, divide, and multiply. It's important. How are you going to be a good steward if you can't count? And so you begin to look at the things that you do in life and the work that you do for the Lord. Remember what Paul said, because of the resurrection that you wouldn't know about unless you were told about, that God captured in this book. That changes everything. Your work under the sun really don't matter outside of that. But that changes everything you do, because it gives it a purpose and a meaning. And that is what God wants us to know, that we cannot figure out on our own, that he has to tell us. And this is the beginning of Ecclesiastes. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much that you have revealed yourself to us through creation, but more importantly, through the Word. The Word made flesh, your Son Jesus Christ, and the words of this book, and the good news of the gospel on the lips of men so many years ago that made these pages that save our soul. When we hear the Word of God, we know that it's by hearing that we come to faith, and by faith we are saved. Not because we figure it out, and not because we get information, but because we have the revelation of Jesus Christ, who gives our lives meaning and purpose, where without you there is no meaning and purpose. We've talked about, God, that the fact that we will not be remembered, most likely, on this earth very long after we die. But the good news of the gospel is that we find out, if we have a relationship with you through Jesus Christ, when we die, you will remember us. And when the guy was hanging on the cross and he said to Jesus, your son, hey, when you get to your kingdom, don't forget about me. He said, I will remember you when I get to my kingdom. That's our hope. And so we thank you for that. Encourage us with that as we move forward through this week, where life gets really frustrating, where life gets really hard, and we don't understand, but we can trust you because you're gracious and you're sovereign. And it's in your name we pray.